the language we use in our practices can work in a poetic way, also become gesture pointing towards reality.
We sometimes don't have the concrete example yet. Maybe the concrete examples are very, embryonary, very small, very indicative of that moment.
This is something that we liked a lot in Hannah Arendt. When she talks about dark times, it's not a sort of pessimism or there's no negativity in talking about dark times. There is always a kind of hope that she envisions.
Hi and welcome to the Porto Design Biennale. My name is André Cruz. You are listening to Voices from the Atelier, a series of 6 podcasts, each dedicated to one alter reality: truth, dignity, play, memory, dream, and language. This is episode 4 and we're going through language in design. Language is foundational to thinking and articulating. Is design in itself a language, or rather a tool that expresses itself through several languages? In its origin, language recognizes the expression of thought through words, through writing, or through signs. But language can also have the power to let us understand and give answers to a more balanced, sustainable, and meaningful society. Taking as a starting point the most recent book, Designing in Dark Times, an Arendtian Lexicon, by Eduardo Staszowski and Virginia Tassinari, we're going to assess the importance of words in the politics of design today. Designing in Dark Times, an Arendtian Lexicon, is part of the Designing in Dark Times book series based in New York. This book uses insights and quotations drawn from Hannah Arendt's major writings to assemble a new kind of lexicon for politics, designing, and acting today. Considering design as a political act, I asked Eduardo and Virginia what was their intention with the publishing of this book in this period of time.
The aim of the series is pushing the boundaries of design in relation not only to acting, but in relation to thought, to thinking, and thinking how we can open more possibilities, genuine possibilities for us to think, to act, and discussing the failures of the present. So there's a sort of like going back and forth in terms of the of past and future, but really thinking about this possibility of the design to seek to offer in some ways a counter view to what we are seeing, to history itself, but also to how we define the future. So I think basically design here is a form of articulation of possibilities. So in that sense, we took on this challenge of discussing language as something that is positioning and foundational to thinking and to articulating. So I'll stop here as just a small, let's say, opening for in general terms what we were trying to achieve or to start, actually.
It's difficult to add something because I think you said it all, Edu. Perhaps the only thing I can add is that the designers, the design theorists, design researchers we addressed with this book. So we gave, those kind of 50 words coming from the work of Hannah Arendt. The way in which we looked, like at looking for the right people to involve in the project was really like people involved with their own practice in society, right? So for us, it was really important to think about the responsibility we have as designers. Which kind of politics do we inform as designers? In which way we we allow other public to contribute to the creation of this common word. Of which common word are we talking about? Is a word common to who? Those are all kind of questions that raised from within the book, and because the people involved in the book were really practicing also design as politics. So I think that was for us a waiver also to see the relevance of the project, but also to see which were the right people, right, to involve in the process.
The recent popularization of the term Anthropocene is a good example of how global common interests are gaining power within society. But there are still a few doubts about how or where do we see action today. This curious gesture of putting together a lexicon that brings Hannah Arendt's ideas into critical conversation makes me question, how do Eduardo Staszowski and Virginia Tassinari analyze the space for concrete action in society today?
Yes, perhaps I can just anticipate on the fact that we also asked ourselves this question, and the fact of having experienced this last year and a half also pushed us to reopen some of the conversations we launched in the book, and that's why we engaged in the kind of a format, very light format of dialogues online, in order to ask this question to all the contributors. And so we took our time to do that. Many of the contributors reacted to this call and, were willing to reread their entries from the eyes of today. So it would take really too long to reply really deeply to your question. But I think this is really what we try to address by having these open dialogues. And I don't know, Eduardo, if you want to add something on this or on our experience on the dialogues or some of the outcomes or the different points of view that emerge from the dialogues.
Yeah, I think one aspect that we've been trying to highlight, I think it speaks to what Andrea was trying to pursue here, is this. Beyond the critical, what we can do to reverse some of this negativity and destruction tendency that is engulfing us, and the sense of hopelessness that is surrounding us. So I think in that sense, I think, and maybe Virginia, you can help me here, is a concept that we are trying to discuss, and I think it is in the book, it is in Arendt, it is in the in the bigger project, is to look at this as critical and at the same time formative moments. This sort of speck of possibility that we are trying to understand, that might not be in the same spaces of design that we've been pursuing, that is somehow related to one particular tradition of designing, some sort of paradigm that is associated to modes of thinking and acting that are tying us together with the way we see the economy, the way we see governance, the way we see culture, the way we see each other. So I think we're trying to identify where we can find those cracks, right? Where we can find new ways of going against what we always thought would be the way of doing, the modes of understanding and living our lives. And that's why it's a very difficult project, because we sometimes don't have the concrete example yet. Maybe the concrete examples are very, embryonary, very small, very indicative of that moment. But again, and they also might be, pushing against, much bigger and stronger models that resist this change. What do you think, Virginia, about the idea of the moments? And maybe we've been discussing lately about this sort of the dialectics of the, of that is implicitly embedded in this condition, which speaks about what we're doing next, Andrea, which is difficult to avoid.
Yes, I think in a sense, the difficulty of the second lexicon is that it embraces Arendt, but it also goes beyond Arendt, right? And I think there are some things. I mean, the more I read Arendt, the more I'm convinced about the necessity also to reading her over and over again. But there was also certain moments of her philosophy in which she looks like she's pointing beyond herself, right? And also pointing beyond the understanding of the word that is, also connected to the age and the situation, the political situation in which Arendt was writing her book. And so rethinking Arendt today necessarily leads also to think beyond her limitations and to think, she talks about thinking out of the banister. And I think this is an exercise to think out of a banister or without a banister even. I think this is really something that talks a lot to us today, like what does it mean also to go beyond certain of the categories of modernity? And what does it mean to look for new epistemologies? Which kind of practices, which kind of gestures, which kind of fragments of knowledge could we collect in order to bring together like a lexicon helping us to go beyond modernity as such? And so you can imagine this is like a very difficult project. And we have been working on this, and this, I could say, the last year. And the more we work on it, the more we see the necessity of it. And the more also we see how difficult it is to also like really engage with new epistemologies and go beyond also ourselves, also go beyond, like the first lexicon. And we did, in which we still strongly believe, but we also see the necessity also to go to step beyond. And for talking about, like you were asking about power and about action. And I think like, in a sense, Arendt really helps my way of designing to go towards that moment in which you act, or in which you engage, or you propose action, or you try to engage in a dialogue. And I think that language there can play a role, because you can translate those different points of view. You can translate those different common interests and try to identify them, right? So there is a task of translation for us as designers in order to empower citizens. So really to generate a possibility for this power to be created, right? In the sense that Arendt points towards. So I see that in my own practice. I mean, it's really very helpful to look at her.
Language is constantly evolving and gaining new forms. With that in mind, I questioned Eduardo and Virginia about the word design. Is it a language or rather a discourse?
We see this notion of design in that is constrained in the space of the profession, that carries a lot of responsibility, because designers are involved in giving shape and understanding possibilities in relation and in coordination with industry and governments and healthcare. And this carries a lot of responsibility professionally. But also we see design as a way of acting, and we argue here as a kind of acting that is reflective and made us think about what kind of world we want, that is embedded in all of us, in the ways that we decide how we engage with the world, the way we engage with our neighbors, we engage with democracy. And I think that's the discussion that is being put forward, I think, with the idea of designing and thinking and living and working into that space. So hopefully it will bring in the non-designer, the non-expert designer and the professional designer in this dialogue, which is opening up and elevating the importance of design in the world, right? I mean, beyond the beyond what we think as design associated to something that is in the surface of things, that it's just kind of being shaping superficially the world. So I think it's not that superficial if you think deeper of the responsibility that we carry as professionals, but also as a person who is designing in their everyday life.
I would say, I totally agree with Eduardo. The way we look at designing is more like a mode of thinking, really, that engages with the word. So it's like a sort of thinking through action, thinking in action. And this way, designing can be seen as a discourse as such. As any discourse, of course, makes use of language, but I think we should talk in plural here. Like, there are many different languages that stems from very different situations from which they are created, right? And that are open and processual, right? So there is a need of crystallizing somehow, designing as a discourse also in order to talk with other disciplines, with other discourses, right? To create together a collaborative discourse. But on the other side, there is also the necessity to keep open this idea of language, right? So the crystallization is always like a temporary operation. So that's why you cannot really, I think, just create a lexicon and close it, but it's always just a way of reformulating thoughts and opening up to the thoughts to the different situation in which they're generated. So I think this is also a sort of exercise for us. And that's also why we also opened up again the first lexicon through the dialogues, because we felt like that this meanings were shifting, were moving, were plural, right? And needed to be also reframed. So again, I think language is really key for designing, but I don't think design is a language. I think design is a discourse, and it's an act of designing. And as being a discourse, it needs to use words. But again, in the use, words are changed, are shifts, right? So they always need to be re-questioned and reformulated. And this is the sort of criticality that we need, I think, in designing as a discourse. So our task, I think, it's not to close meaning, but just to open up and create a platform for thinking critically those words or those meanings.
Language sustains systems of power, and it was violently used as a deadly weapon by colonialism. Colonizers were responsible for the loss of several native languages by imposing their own. Still today, there is violence present in many words we commonly use, or listen to them being used without realizing its true depth.
Indeed, there are certain words that, have a lot of violence or bring some dynamics of power that are at play there. Like if you think the idea of development or innovation, right? Those are words that we've been using a lot in design, but actually there is a whole idea of what innovation is, like it's like progress, all those kind of words that are overloaded by meanings, and they bring like a mindset, a way of thinking, which is very violent, right? And that puts, like the interest of humans beyond the interest of the planet, for instance, just to name one, right? And so the fact that we use this word so long also informed the way we thought. And so that's why they're kind of buzzwords or like words that needs to be problematized, I think. And other words, perhaps, that are, like bringing also another way of thinking, another epistemology that is not like so much directed towards the future as thinking like, the future of progress, the future of humanity, like, a kind of rhetoric that we understood long, that it's a misconception, it's a fallacious one, it's a dangerous one, but we are still using those words. So I think there's some work there. And there are many people, I think, out there at this moment that are aware of this and trying to inform their thinking by using other words.
Just a quick thought about it, how some of these words, they sustain ideologies or sustain systems of power. I was reading today about a polemic in design, and some people justifying some action, say, well, this is a pursuit of perfectionism, right? In our field of doing the good work. And somebody was saying this notion of perfection is also associated with some form of white supremacy.
Language not only expresses identities, but also constructs them. Our language is actually our identity. How can we observe questions of identity in cities, for instance, where the blurring of language diversity is mostly favored?
Yeah, it's funny that you're asking this now, because I had a conversation today for a project I'm working at with the Politecnico di Milano in this neighborhood of Milano called Nolo. And I was talking with a few artists that are also working on the neighborhood, because we were confronting our practices there and on the topic of multilingualism. So it's really on what we are talking now. And it was kind of coincidence, perhaps, but some of us, so like ourselves as a research group, but also some artists, were working on this idea of creating vocabularies stemming from neighborhoods, and looking at ways also to involve other languages, so to allow multilingualism in those vocabularies, also for enabling a different sense of empowerment of the different communities present in the neighborhood. So it's not just a matter of understanding each other, but it's also the symbolic value of the language, right? What does it mean if you hear someone, if you live abroad and you hear someone speaking your language and sharing with you thoughts in your own language? I also do not live in my own country, so I know exactly what this means, and I know how important language is if you work with the community, with people coming from different origins, right? And this goes also beyond just the verbal use. It goes also about non-verbal languages, so how to use the bodies and this, how to also use for instance, performances in order to express meanings also beyond the verbal communication. So I think there is a work of translation that we could do there, like engaging with neighbors and with different languages from neighbors, but also like go beyond verbal languages, so engage with other forms of bodily languages or embodied languages. So I think this is really critical. This is really important. And if you also go beyond like the work in neighbors as it is in my own practice, I think it's really important to engage with different languages and even with dialects, right? Because dialects are really, like disappearing languages, which are, I think, really important because often dialects, they really weave languages together, right? If you look at places which are on the borders, like geographical borders, it's very much the case for me, because I live in Belgium and my language is Flemish, but like if you go beyond close to the Dutch border or to the French border, our dialect mixes up with the other languages. So that's something very interesting happening in dialects, I think, that should also be more addressed within our own design practices. I think even metaphorically, like what does it mean? And I like even my family, we have so many languages we use in our family. We are basically three languages as main languages in the family. And you need all three of them to express what you think. I think our society is going also more and more towards this sort of richness. So how can we as designers also work politically in order to acknowledge this richness and to engage with it? I think it's a real challenge, and there is a potential in working with situated vocabularies in order also to, open up this cultural discussion in neighbors by engaging in conversation which touches on multi-languages issues.
Language is identity. Therefore, I asked some of my guests for a personal view on what the specific themes of this podcast meant to them. Here is Susan Schuppli speaking about truth.
I think the question of what is truth, this is where I would follow Michel Foucault in this regard. Foucault said truth is the limit condition of what we can know at any given moment. And I think that really holds a lot of resonance for me. So what we come to understand as a set of truths is a consequence of what can be known at a given moment, and a whole set of, in some way, shared beliefs, consensus, etc., right? So in the same way that people would have believed that the world was flat, that was a truth at that moment because there wasn't the means to understand the curvature of the earth. It's so if we follow kind of Foucault's notion of truth, we understand that that's potentially a kind of malleable term, and I think that's its productive value, but that's also potentially its danger, right? But that to say that doesn't mean that just anything goes. And I think that's really important. I would say to say that truth is the limit condition of what can be known at a given moment doesn't mean that just all of these alternate facts are okay either, right? We have to understand that the production of truth requires a tremendous amount of labor, intellectual kind of labor. So it's not that every single truth is equal to any other, but it's how is it that consensus making forums produce certain kinds of claims, right? And we have to sort of like constantly be critical and question those truth-making kind of forums. But I do believe that the conception of truth that we hold at a given moment is a consequence of the horizon of what can be known with our cognitive capacities, but also our technological apparatuses, etc., right? And if we can think about, the ways in which the world of quantum physics completely changed our understandings of the ways in which the world is organized, right? And there's a kind of, when a new epistemic framework emerges, it can radically undo kind of prevailing kind of truths. So I think that's the way I'd like to answer it. So they both in relationship to the inheritance from Foucault, but also with the cautionary note that it doesn't mean that every other truth is equally available to us, right? And anything goes. That's not what I'm saying at all.
And now, Alice Grandoit on dignity.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't know that I will ever have a conversation with anybody in which I don't have take the opportunity to mention a book that was quite transformative for me, which is very much the center of where we started with Dean. It is a book called Emergent Strategy by a wonderful and brilliant thinker, Adrienne Maree Brown. I love this book so much because I call it like a living, breathing toolkit that really helps us assess like what our relationship to change is by this idea of what Adrian calls like listening with why. And I think that I'm just so fascinated by it, really honing in on my capacity to constantly become a better listener. And sometimes I feel like everybody's always interested in like the inquiry, but I'm also like, there's the inquiry through the listening. And I actually do believe that learning experientially is what helps us kind of like helps guide us in terms of growth, but also in terms of like how we can come up with innovative, maybe new ways of thinking about things. I think that Adrienne Marie Brown's work is a tremendous act of dignity for somebody just really taking the time to like document all of their learnings, document all of their observations, give us a toolkit, but also give us a toolkit that is actually accessible in language, which I think is so important as well. Like I don't, there's only so much like theory that somebody could read. And also when we think a lot about theory, a lot of that language is exclusive to how people that practice within the institution, which is a very small amount of people. Actually, I know maybe here in Europe, it feels a little bit more accessible, but the average person doesn't speak like that. And thus, to get them to read this, like to read something that could actually inspire change on a theoretical level, then I think the language just needs to be more engaging. And I think that Adrienne Marie Brown just writes so eloquently, but just in a way that's quite conversational, and in a way that kind of, I think, provides a lot of cultural references that people can actually start to understand some of the concepts that she's sharing.
Marta Rios tells us about her personal view on the word play.
Play for me is to be able to see some, like, to just whatever, like you're having breakfast, for example, and then, I don't know, you're able to use that thing that you have every morning, the same thing, like coffee, a plate, a toast, and then somehow like do something, like turn it, like see something else, see that it can be something else, like to be able to turn normality into something else, whatever that means to you, but to have fun, to see a stick as a broom, to all these things that we do when we are kids that then somehow we forget, but like, when you're like brooming and then you start playing the guitar, for me, this is play. It's like seeing objects or things in a different way.
Paul Sahre goes through what memory means to him.
My dad was an aerospace engineer. He died in 2009.
Yeah, because he died like...
right after you guys were born.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my son's in the room here. And he met them briefly, but he just wasn't in their life, and it sucked because he was great. I mean, he was great person, great dad. So, I was always kind of thinking of meaningful ways of sharing my dad with my boys, as they got older. Well, I was in the attic years after, kind of going through his stuff, and I found this old launch pad that he had built for a model rocket. And it reminded me of something that was a really potent memory. He, as I said, he was an aerospace engineer. He was flight simulators was his thing. But this was during the Apollo, 1973. It was during the Apollo, right at the end of the Apollo missions to the moon. And I think it's partially to share it with us. He built a model rocket that was like of the Apollo, the Saturn V, with all the details and everything. And you put the explosives in the tail and you launch it up. It has parachutes. So you're supposed to be able to launch it multiple times and retrieve it. The thing was like as big as I was at the time. He brought the whole family. It took him forever to build it. He took the whole family out and then he launched it rather than just putting it on his shelf, and it went up and the parachutes didn't come out and this thing just plummeted to the ground, was destroyed. And there are all these photos. He had my grandparents come up from New Jersey to watch it. There's photos of all of us, before, but there's no photograph of the wreckage, But I just remember just running as a kid through this open field and hearing my dad go, "Oh no," screaming at the top of his lungs. So it was the 40th anniversary of this thing. I found the launch pad. I was like, you know what? This would be cool. So I ended up doing a Kickstarter thing. I just did it on a Kickstarter to raise money, but the idea was to relaunch the Saturn V and try to see if I could, have it be successful, And I joked around, like, if it hadn't failed, who knows? I could have been a doctor or a lawyer. It could have changed the trajectory of my life. This model rocket had not crashed. So I found an original one on eBay that had never been built, the same model my dad has. I built it. We brought everybody out to the place where he launched it originally. And I almost got arrested. The State Highway Patrol came. We didn't have a permit to be there. And long story short, it became this kind of long, drawn out thing. But I read this somewhere that a memory remains closer and more pure the less you access it. And the more you trample on it, the more you remember it, the more you change it. It's sort of like whispering in someone's ear and having them go all the way around, and by the time it gets back to you, it's something totally different. That sort of thing. And I trampled the hell out of this memory. So this really specific kind of amazing little thing is like sort of gone now. It's been overwritten in the remembering of it, in what happened after. I think my larger thing, well, again, was to share it with my boys, but the idea of sharing a memory with somebody is sort of not attainable in any other way by looking at photos or, but in the end, I did that. And I think in some ways it just kind of lessened something that was a nice little thing that I had, by going back to it. And I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think memory is malleable. Memory is personal, but don't mess with it. Would be my advice to the unsuspecting people who will want to dabble in nostalgia or whatever form that takes.
Susana Carreiras tells us about her personal view of the word dream.
I think that we people that come from Western culture and we grew up with the sense that the act of sleep and the act of dream is less important than be physically awake. And I think that this is directly connected to the sense of production too, or the idea we create of it. So have a job and eat and walk. It's more important than to dream. But the truth is that it is a lot of this like silence action while we are dreaming, and I think that we can also be productive while we are dreaming. And somehow my definition of dream since I was really young do not fix with these close definitions and concepts. I do pay attention to my dreams, and I'm really committed to follow them and listening to them. And I feel that place who have access while we stop and we slow down and we mute the logic and the ego, it's the place to see, to heal and unblock our biggest fears and our biggest traumas. And it is a place that guides us through decisions more aligned to our souls and to ourselves. I believe that every person is unique and ever proposed in this life, and dreams are a powerful tool to guide us in our path. So, and also, while we are dreaming, we can have access to other realities and feel connection and also be able to communicate with other beings, for example, plant spirits and animal spirits that are much more able to connect with us while we are dreaming, while we are sleeping. We are in a state where you don't have these mind boundaries, and we are able to see more than with the eyes and with the ego.
If we spoke a different language, we would perceive a somewhat different world, said the German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, Roughly 7,000 languages are spoken in the world today. It is an act of care to listen, to understand, even non-verbal languages, as Virginia Tassinari mentioned. Wittgenstein was also the author of the famous quote, "The limits of my language means the limits of my world." Are we, as a whole, being curious enough about other forms of expression? Are we prepared for new dialogues and to go beyond the limits of our language? This was the 4th episode of the Voices from the Atelier, a podcast from the 2021 Porto Design Biennale. In the next episode, we will address dream. See you next week. I would like to thank my friend Pedro Geraldes, who made the music for this podcast. A big thank you to Alistair Fuad-Luke, Magda Seifert, Raquel Paz, Rui Caldas, and the Porto Design Biennale team. And finally, I want to thank my wonderful guests Virginia Tassinari and Eduardo Staszowski for their precious time.
Well, I'm kind of allergic to definitions, and perhaps that's already part of the answer to the question. My approach to languages is from my background in philosophy, because that was my topic, my master thesis, and also my PhD thesis has been, like working on this idea of language, and basically our language cannot cover reality and cannot really grasp reality. So we need to step beyond language. And our artistic practices, that was particularly the topic of my PhD, can somehow, and I think design practices also, of course, can point towards reality instead and then just addressing it verbally, right? And how eventually the language we use in our practices can work in a poetic way. So also become gesture pointing towards reality.